I would like to describe a field in which little has been done, but in which an enormous amount can be done. This field is not quite the same as the others in that it will tell us little of fundamental physics, but it will tell us much about the strange phenomena that occur just below our perception. In contrast to the natural philosophers of the past, the scientists of this field delve into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. Their quest is to understand and create the imperceptible. After all, there is plenty of room at the bottom.
Hello and welcome to the Materialism Podcast, an exploration of the past, present, and future of material science and engineering. My name is Andrew Falkowski. I'm a student at the University of Utah, and I'm joined by Dr. Taylor Sparks. Taylor, how's it going?
Summer's here, man. Best time of the year. It doesn't get better.
I thought summer was here until we got a winter storm in the middle of May.
No joke. May 8th or something, I had the best ski day of the entire season. It was completely wild, man.
No, I mean, we got like just the taste of summer, and I was into it. The day before, I was at the park on a sunny hill, was reading a book, and then the next day, there's snow on the ground.
And you're back in the house waiting for sunny days. I know. I got bees, and my bees, I do beekeeping, and they were so happy the first couple of days, and now they've just boarded it up. They're waiting it out. We'll see if they come out today. Okay, today we have an awesome episode. We're going to talk about a topic that I thought I kind of knew well, and it's clear that I didn't. And to help us understand it, we've got one of my favorite people, one of the smartest guys I know, Sergei Kalinin, joining us. Sergei, tell us a bit about yourself.
So great to be here. So currently I am a professor at the University of Tennessee-Knoxville. So before then, I spent 20 years at Oak Ridge National Laboratory working in the user center. So I started as the Wigner Fellow. I left when I was a group leader and the corporate fellow. Slightly unusual thing about myself is that in between Oak Ridge and the academia, I decided to see how the real world works. So I spent a year at Amazon in the special project divisions. You know, it's kind of equivalent of the Amazon equivalent of the Google X, where the idea is to see how the scientific ideas grow at the risk and become a part of the Amazon product line. So that's the short story.
Fantastic. A sabbatical at Amazon, that's not typical. Was it a good experience?
It was super good. So it's something that I can unambiguously recommend for pretty much everyone in academia. So as a scientist, we are exceptionally well familiar with the ideas. We generally want to have these ideas materialized, but in the end, we think that when something is done, we have a publication out of it. For the last maybe 5 years, we know that publications are not enough. We actually need to share code. We need to share data. In other words, science is useless if those that come after us cannot build upon that. And paper is, of course, a very narrow foundation to build on. But still, it is totally different from the industrial setting when the ultimate goal is to have a product in 5 years, and ideally it would be a commercially successful product. So the way that it affects the way you think, the venues of the research and the engineering inquiry you will explore is just amazing.
Absolutely. It is totally different reward structure, totally different timelines, totally different everything from academia. So it's cool that you're able to sort of traverse both, plus national labs, giving you a pretty well-rounded perspective on the different options out there for science.
Pretty much. In terms of the national labs, they can also be fairly heterogeneous. So the different labs have different priorities and figures of merit. So I've spent 20 years in the BS part of the DOE world, which is basically aligned with the academia as close as possible. So we go to the same conferences. Our primary measure of performance is the publications in high-profile journals. So it's not terribly different from academia in terms of where we are going with the research in the BS labs.
Cool. Well, we've got you on today, Sergei, because you, of probably anybody that I know, I consider you like the expert in microscopy, especially microscopy plus ML, right? Which is going to be kind of the topic of what we cover today. And you sent me a this, what I at the time thought was this super bizarre message on Twitter saying like, hey, let's do an episode on, what'd you say, electron microscope beam assembly of matter, atom by atom. And I was like, what is he been smoking? Like, what is he been talking about? Because, I'm like a generalist material scientist. I'm not a microscopist, but like I also kind of know about the technique. I've done a little bit of TEM. I've done a little bit of SEM. But what you described there, assembling matter atom by atom, that was not something that I thought microscopy could do. So in today's episode, I want you to get me up to speed. And any of our listeners that might fall in that same category of thinking like, yeah, I'm kind of aware of microscopy, but say what now? Help us understand what exactly has happened over the last 30 years in this area of assembly via microscopy.
Sounds like a plan. So look at it this way. So we always consider microscopy as primarily the technique that allows us to characterize materials, right?
Yep.
And there is always a little bit of push and shove about how really useful the microscopy is. So we know that intellectually, if we use the microscopy to look at the single crystal, that's probably not going to be the most rewarding experience, right? So we are just going to see atoms sitting at their own sites, and that's basically it. Microscopy becomes useful only if our material is non-ideal. So we are sort of expand to see the real structure, defects, how close they're aligned. The development in the high-resolution microscopy illustrated that we can not only resolve atoms, but to see how they're displaced from the high symmetry positions. So all of a sudden, we can visualize the order parameter fields like ferroelectric, octahedral, all the other things that make the physics of the materials interesting. But for a very long time, basically from the beginning of the electron microscopy at Ernst Ruska time till maybe 2010 or so, the assumption was that we want to use microscopes only to visualize the materials.
Right.
My early interest in the machine learning stemmed from the fact that microscopes generate large volumes of data. Manually analyzing images may be not a long-term pathway to success, so we need to have ML tools to help us do that. But in all cases, the feeling was that we just want to see what's out there, and ideally, we don't want to touch anything. So the less our imaging condition affect the material, the better.
I was just going to say, like when I was an undergrad taking my very first images, we looked at some polymer materials, and I remember seeing for the first time in real time, like, oh, the beam, like if you let it just chill on the sample, you're actually like ablating or whatever you're doing to it, you're destroying your sample. You can see like the little tattoo that you just gave it. And so the idea I always thought is like, oh, you want to avoid that. You don't want to interact with your sample. You just want to visualize it. And obviously it's impossible to not interact in some way, but you want to minimize that. And what I'm hearing from you is that not only is that not necessarily the case, but you can be intentional about the way that you interact with the sample to get thoughtful sort of outcomes.
Exactly. And this is exactly where the dual background in scanning probe microscopy and electron microscopy came in handy, I think. Because in scanning probe microscopy, from the first days of the STM, it was known that the STM tip can move atoms around. And the way that people observed it in the early 90s was that imagine that you look at the surface of the gold or semiconductor. Sometimes you can see the clear atomic lattice, so all atoms are in place. Sometimes you see the add atoms that form kind of nice ordered patterns. And sometimes the atom will look like a fuzzball.
Yeah.
And obviously, atom cannot be a fuzzball. If it is a fuzzball, that means that it's actually sitting in some form of potential well, and when it interacts with the STM tip, it starts to move around, and you basically see not the atom itself, but the dynamic picture of how atom jumps around on the surface within some small volume. And there were quite a few papers by folks like at UCLA, for example, that basically said that, oh, we can have molecular rotors, or we can have dynamics, and so on and so forth. And a long time ago, folks at IBM, so in Don Eigler group, I speculate, but the assumption was that if atoms can move under the action of the tip, can we really be deliberate about moving it? So that was a STM story. And we know that for about 30 years, moving atoms by the scanning tunneling microscopy tip was the only way to control matter on the atomic level. And then about year 2010, so that was the time when the aberration correction became a big thing. And at Oak Ridge, there was a big group under Steve Pennycook, where people started to observe the 2D materials in the electron microscope basically with fairly high throughput. So it was not like you have one successful experiment every month and then you write paper in Nature. It was you have a successful experiment pretty much every day. And they started to notice that sometimes the atoms become a fuzzball. So you look at the electron microscopy image, some atoms are well defined and some of them look like they're kind of moving around. Or you can even see half of the atom, right? We all know that you cannot kind of exactly cut the atom by the electron beam. If you see half of the atom, it means that the electron beam started to interact with the atom and then the atom shifted to a different position.
Uh-huh.
And it became clear that at some point you can even see the atom in action. So you can see half of the atom at one atomic site and then another half of the atom at another atomic site. And what's going on? It's very clear that the electron beam somehow excites the atom, so the atom jumps to the adjacent location. But from this moment, it is a very small step for saying that, you know what, if by regularly scanning beam, we can accidentally move atom from one place to another, maybe we can move the beam deliberately to move the atom from one location to another where we want it to be. So that was the thought probably around 10 years ago, so slightly more than that. The difficult parts, however, becomes that in order to do that, there are small, quote unquote, small technical steps you have to take. So electron microscopes are absolutely not built for the user to tell the electron beam where to go. So in fact, they have service contracts. Secondly, you kind of need to know where the beam should be for the atom to move where you want it to be. So you need to understand why this phenomena happen, and you need to have the engineering control of the instrument in order to do it the way that you want. And then the final thing is that you see electron microscopes are much faster than humans. So human can, I mean, if you play things like Smash Bros. Or Doom, your reaction rate is faster than average. But generally, humans can perform several operations per second. And as my experience with the Doom suggests, that actually goes down with the time. So I was never able to play the last versions because it's just too complex.
It's too fast.
I mean, once you have to have this damn dash jump or something else, I cannot do that. I had to ask my kids to come and help me get to the more complex parts. But electron microscope is still faster. It can change things on the time scale of milliseconds, which basically means that if you want to do it at a reasonable rate, you somehow need to use the machine learning in order to control your microscope and in a meaningful manner. So that was the challenge.
And that's got to be tricky too, right? Because you can only respond as fast as you can collect information, right? So even with machine learning, right, are you still limited by the rate at which you can collect an image to know where the atom is? And are things like vibrations and other sort of noise that comes through in the imaging process, do those affect it?
Yeah,
to some extent, yes. But the important thing is that electron microscopes, again, are very, very fast, right? So the beam current in the electron microscope is typically a fraction of nanoamp, which basically means that you have 1 billion of electrons going through the sample per second. You don't need that many electrons to form some signal indicative of the presence of atoms. So the classical electron microscope can give you data in milliseconds. There are versions of the ultra-fast detector that can do it in microsecond. So the dynamic range between how fast you can connect information versus the range at which humans can operate is easily multiple orders of magnitude.
And so, Andrew mentions that, okay, there's the collection, but then there's also usually some sort of post-processing, I'm guessing, with microscopy. And so if there's a step that has to happen, if you have to process it to, say, to get the exact position of atom, you're going to do a representation of it now, that could be also slower. So it doesn't matter how fast your ML is because it's waiting on that post-processing step from the raw image anyways. Is that the case? Like, where are we at? Or maybe it's the same with compressed sensing, right? You're not going to measure every single pixel. You're going to measure some of them and fill in the gaps with the others. Are these slowing you down in your ML pipeline as well?
So for the time being, that has not been the bottleneck. So for the time being, the bottlenecks are actually quote unquote boring engineering things, like the positioning of the beam. So we know that the details of the electron beam interaction with the nucleus and the processes that electron beam induce in the material very sensitively depend on where the beam is with respect to the atom. So, for example, if your beam is going directly through atomic column, in some sense, all your momentum is perpendicular to the atomic plane, if you talk about the 2D material. So that we cannot expect the atom to move to any specific direction. So after a lot of trial and errors by my colleagues in Oak Ridge, we figure out that the atom actually moves towards the electron beam if the electron beam is halfway between the atom and its neighbor. So the exact mechanism by itself is fairly complex, and we speculate that the way it works is that we almost excite a single chemical bond from the bonding to anti-bonding state. Then we have the isomerization of this bond structure, and as the result, it relaxes to the new atomic configuration. That being said, from the point of view of application, the exact theoretical mechanism maybe is not that important.
Yeah, who
What you need
cares?
to know
Can you move it?
exactly, can you move it, and how precisely and with which reproducibility can you move it? That's ultimately what matters from the point of view of the fabrication, electron microscopy, and ML.
Yeah, so in one of the papers you sent, you had sort of a standard setup that you calibrated against. I can't remember, it was like 90 picoamps or something like that. And in the paper you mentioned that it's over the 5 seconds or whatever that it's on the, or maybe it's 5 milliseconds, you're dropping like something like 3 billion electrons, which immediately made me wonder like, okay, this is a really cool thing that you're showing me, but can this scale? Are we going to see some sort of dramatic change in architecture of microscopes that would allow us to do? I never thought that E-beam lithography would be a thing, and it is, right? Are we going to see something similar where we'd be able to move individual atoms to actually make devices, or is this only going to be in the proof of concept phase?
That's a super good question, and that depends on kind of how useful it is. You are right that the key question here is what are the downstream application? Because strictly speaking, people knew that electron beam can modify solids on essentially atomic or atomic plane level for at least 40 years. So 40 years ago, you can find papers. At that time, the electron microscopy was much less developed than it is now. But there are papers where people say, look, we can have amorphous silicon or amorphous gallium arsenide. The electron beam can make it crystalline. And you can observe this process of crystallization, essentially one atomic plane at a time. So it's almost like a 3D printing, but 3D printing when the electron
The
beam
phase.
serves the role of the high energy excitation. And at that time, it was curiosity. And if you go through the literature, you can easily see that people have rediscovered this phenomenon many, many times. So, and if you talk to the folks who have been in the electron microscopy community for a while, they basically say, hey, we tried it, it was never useful. So once we go to the atomic fabrication, the ultimate goal, ultimate question, and that's something that I learned when I was at Amazon, who is the customer? So what part of the quantum science or material science or condensed matter physics will benefit from this capability? And in microscopy community, there are excellent examples of the techniques such as cryo-EM, where there was a very sharp inflection point before it was something interesting but not particularly useful. So until maybe 2014, cryo-electron microscopy was typically referred as blobology at the conferences, which is not a very endearing term. And the reason was that, yes, you can observe the biological molecules frozen in ice, but you don't learn much. And then because of the progress in the electron microscopy in general, the resolution of cryo-electron microscopy passed the threshold at which you can start to visualize the molecules with the resolution sufficient to draw some conclusions about their biological function. And lo and behold, the cryo-electron microscopy becomes a key technique to explore the structure of the biomolecules, drug target, protein interactions, and so on and so forth. And now you have startups that invest in cryo-EM. AstraZeneca buys multiple cryo-electron microscopy stations. So in other words, now there is a downstream application, and this downstream application is the whole biology and medicine. So same thing is going to happen for the atomic fabrication. If this is a proof of concept experiments, it will remain proof of concept experiment for quite a while. Are there reasons to be optimistic? I mean, I'm obviously is supposed to be optimistic about it, right?
I mean, it's your field, man. Sell me. Sell it to me.
I would otherwise I wouldn't be doing it for 10 years. But there are a few examples I can think about. So the most obvious one and probably the lowest hanging fruit is the fabricated nanopores for the protein sequencing, the precision medicine. So this is the field where there are already companies like Northern Nanopore that essentially make the device. One device has only one nanopore, so it's not like you have a fabrication threshold and you need to make a billion for that to be useful. The key question is it the case that the atomically precise nanopore will give you better results for the protein sequencing than the one that's formed by the dielectric breakdown? If it is the case, then there already is a market. If it is not the case, then we don't know. But the key part here is to figure out whether this is the case or not. So we don't know yet the answer. Another example where it may be useful is things related to the quantum communication. So whether quantum computing will emerge and whether quantum computers would be based on the solid state qubits or something else is pretty much in the air. Quantum communication is very much the thing now. So being able to fabricate the single defect complexes that can work at the single photon emitter, that may have a market. So I don't know whether this market will be realized in 3 years or 10 years. I don't know how it will compare to the existing techniques out there, but at least there is a connection.
I could see it. So it sounds like the proof of concept is there, and there might be an application, but we need to get better at the actual movement of atoms, which is what the paper is about that you sent to us. So I like that early on in the paper you say, like, the people that have been doing this for a while by hand, turning knobs, right, actually moving the beam around, have sort of realized that if you want to, first off, we're talking about graphene. You've got a sheet of graphene, and we're going to put a single silicon in there, right? And if you want to move that silicon from one spot to the next, what they've done in the past is they just hit the beam on the carbon next to it, basically, and that caused it to jump over there.
Yep.
And it sounded like what you guys wanted to explore is, are there other rules, right? Instead of just doing this sort of simple heuristic, can we come up with a model? Are there better ways to move things? Are there unexpected things? And so it sounds like you tried a bunch of different scenarios. You planted the beam on many different spots, not just directly on the atom, but at different sort of X and Y positions away from it, and then quantified what happened, which was not easy because, things shift and move, right? Your sample, it sounds like you've got the specimen drift problem, and not all the, the dopant and the carbon don't have the same contrast. So this sounds like a tricky problem to pull off. Do you want to tell us a bit about it?
So in this case, most of the credit goes to my colleague Kevin Roccapriori at ORNL. So I started this line of inquiry more than 10 years ago by now. So Kevin is last in the line of several teams at ORNL that explore this direction. And before, maybe half a year before I left ORNL for Amazon, I built the collaboration between our team and the folks at the Google Brain who were interested in building the reinforcement learning framework to make this process automated. So Kevin basically essentially spent every hours on time when he was in the Microscopy with the Google folks in order first to make sure that they speak the same language, right? So it's not the easiest connection between folks working on Google and electron microscopists.
Nope, I bet not.
Secondly, figure out how we can, in principle, control this process. So what is the ML algorithm for doing that? How to deal with the fact that amount of the data coming in the experiment is usually much smaller than the ML folks are used for. It's like when you play the Mario game or chess in silica, you can do it as many times as you want, and then you can always get extra computer power if necessary. So whatever is done on the instruments takes a lot of time and effort, and the experiment does not scale. It is what it is. It is a linear time on the instrument. So that being said, it is doable. The difficult parts appear in the fact that the real world and the idealized environment are not the same thing. So, for example, the biggest problem for Kevin was to make sure that the electron beam goes exactly where the control algorithm tells it to, as opposed to be a little bit off because of the non-ideality of the scanning system.
Right.
And this small thing ended up being a separate half a year project of how to actually pinpoint the beam and sort of target the atom, exactly the atom that you want. Because if you're off, then even a small discrepancy between the intended position and the real position will throw off your algorithm. And we are talking about the positions being off by 10% of the atomic radius.
Yeah,
So
this is just wild that you can actually do this, that microscopes are that good.
As well as that they let you do that too, right? A lot of
interface.
instruments, and it's becoming more available, and it seems that that was essential in making this research work as well. Usually lock a lot of that stuff down. They don't want you to actually going in and turning the dials manually. They want it to go through a controlled interface, so so that you don't break it.
Absolutely true. So we started to work on the automated microscopy in Oak Ridge somewhere around 2008, 2009. So first it was scanning probe microscopy, and the reason for that was ultimately scanning probe microscopy at that time tended to have more open architectures. And secondly, the price of error was much smaller.
How come? What do you mean?
In SPM, if something goes wildly wrong, this is a 200-300K tool. And generally, it is very unlikely that the damage that you can incur will exceed 10K to fix. Electron microscopes are relatively more expensive, so usually they come at the cost of $5 million a pop. They typically have a service contract, so if you start to work with the electron microscope, you need to be prepared to lose the service contract protection, and then we talk about hundreds of cases per year. So we were lucky because at the early work in this area in something like 2014, 2015, we worked with folks like Andy Lupini, who was one of the original 3 inventors of the aberration corrector. So he knew the electron microscope architecture inside out. So at that time, the progress was slow because you have to have a guy in the room who knows the electron microscope hardware, the person who deals with the custom controllers, and then the person who actually runs the experiment. So it was slow. Things started to change about 4 years ago when the Neon, the company that built the microscope, started to provide the API for the Python interface. So it has become possible to take the Python codes and deploy them directly on the instrument. And I remember very well the early COVID days when one of aforementioned Kevin was actually working on the microscope from home. So he goes to the lab, loads the sample, make sure that the sample is in the microscope. Then he goes to his house and basically spends the whole night working with the microscope, trying to figure out how to deploy the deep kernel learning, how to make atom moves, and so on and so forth. And what's interesting is that at that time, the progress still took us a while. So it was maybe 2 years when we could say that even with the API, we are comfortable running the ML algorithm directly on the live microscope. And of course, each time you try to do new things, you need to develop the hardware and control component, which is not a part of the ML workflows directly. But what's very remarkable is that the rate at which we can drive this development by now accelerated by order of magnitude. So I started to work at UT barely a year ago. So by now we have the Thermo Fisher microscope, which is integrated with the University of Tennessee supercomputer. And that did not take us 3 years. So at this point, it took us 3 months. And in the same amount of time, we were able to build the interface between the scanning probe microscope and supercomputer. So again, you can run the experiment, you can stream data to the supercomputer, you can stream the control signals back again. So first time, it took forever. Second time, it was already a finite amount of time and it was done well. And the third time, it looks like that this type of capabilities are becoming available at the microscopy center next to you. It's still difficult, but it's not outstandingly difficult.
One question thinking about this is, with any sort of manufacturing process or any sort of scientific approach, there's usually a question of reliability, right? Like how, even if you find the optimal place to put your beam, how reliable is it that you can actually move the atom?
So that's an excellent question. And let's look at it a little bit from different perspective. So for the time being, we discussed that the primary thing to figure out are there end-use applications. So these are not cheap experiments. These are fairly risky experiments. Uh, you can write high-profile paper about doing something like this kind of maybe only once. There is nothing wrong about it, but ultimately this field worth investing time and effort if and only if we have the end use. However, let's assume that there is an end use case. So there are people coming to us and say, guys, look, this particular atomic configuration can make a next generation quantum computer. So what we need is to scale. How far can you go if you have a sufficient, how far can the technology allow you to go if you can make a sufficient investment? Well, in order to answer this question, let's look at what determines the rate at which the structures can be fabricated in the electron microscope. So the ultimate answer is the number of the high energy electrons going through the system, because that's actually what ultimately causes the reaction. This goes to the very interesting point that the beam-induced phenomenon in solid very much depends on the energy of the electron. So if the electron has a large energy, then it is prone to produce the knockoff effects and move things around. If the electron has a lower energy, then it is very unlikely to destroy the material. So there is still damage, but it usually emerges due to slightly more complex mechanisms. So the question becomes, if somebody says, look, just let it rip, what would be the ideal system for performing this type of manipulation? And what are the pathways in which you can develop the technology? So my first answer is that currently we are limited to the system where we have to maintain the balance between the observation, so getting the image or figuring out where the beam should go, and manipulation. Therefore, we try to manipulate in the regime where our imaging is relatively slow and the high energy events which move atom around are fairly rare. So in some sense, we are limited to manipulation on the level of the seconds or fraction of the second, because if we increase the beam current or the beam energy, we will not be able to monitor material. We will be just modifying it. Are we stuck there? Absolutely not. So there is absolutely no reason why we cannot have two electron beams going at the same point in the solid, one beam having the fairly low energy, and we use it for non-invasive imaging, another beam coming with the high energy, and then we use it for manipulation.
That's a cool idea.
So that's entirely doable. It's not going to be cheap. So if you try to build the electron microscope that's, for example, interfaced with the ion beam facility, so you can observe the internal beam-induced dynamic, these tools
This reminds me of
pricey.
like what Teresa Pollock's doing with her tri-beam. It's not the same, but it's a similar idea that you've got your ablation, you've got your EBSD, you've got your imaging, all of these in the same instrument.
Exactly. So there is a record of building these tools. First time we build one, it's not going to be cheap. You probably wouldn't start it with less than 20 mil budget and very good collaboration with the electron microscopy manufacturers.
Right.
But the technology for doing there is there, and it's available. There are other tricks one can play. So for example, once we have the electron beam, there is no reason why the electron beam cannot be multiplexed. Simply because there are a lot of electrons, it's not a problem to go from billions to tens and hundreds of billions of electrons per second. Multiplexed electron microscopy exists. So Zeiss and other companies actually build them for the characterization of wafers when you want to scan a large volume.
Really? I didn't know
They're
that.
obviously, I discovered it a few years ago, and that was kind of pretty surprising. But there is a lot of very cool electron microscopy development done in the context of the semiconductor characterization.
Yeah, I'm not
And
surprised.
it's actually, if you think about it, when it comes to the semiconductors, these guys can afford pretty hefty price tags, right?
And the defects that they're looking for are well suited for microscopy, right? Like they're looking for the types of things that you can find there. This is the right tool for it. Now they just need to scale. And so multiplex SEM, I'm learning new things every day. This is wild.
So then if you try to just think about whether these two concepts can be combined, imagine that you have 64 beams, sort of large multiplication. You have pushed your dynamic range for another 3 orders of magnitude because you use high energy electrons for manipulation and low energy electrons for observation. So you can argue that getting to the level of thousands of assembly events per second is actually doable with the technology that we have. Beyond that point, it's difficult to predict because, we typically can predict technologically next step or maybe next two steps. We're already talking about combining two steps,
Right.
but this should be doable. Whether there would be some fundamental mechanism that like heat accumulation or what's not that will prevent doing things at this rate, we don't know. So we can speculate in terms of the possibilities, but implementation has to be done step by step with the specific milestone and benchmark at every moment. There is no other way to do that.
So what we haven't yet talked about that might be an interesting thing to shift to then is if this is possible, if we have microscopes that, holy cow, we can Python control them and we can shift on the fly what we're looking for, how does that change the way that scientists interact with microscopes and other instruments for characterization, right? I feel like there's a paradigm shift coming. We've talked about machine learning for property prediction, for structure prediction. That stuff's become very well known. In the last couple of years, we've seen generative models, like our group's been working in that. But there's a couple things that have been under investigated. One of them is processing, tying the sort of nitty gritty, boring aspects of, okay, when you process materials, trying to use ML for that. But then another one might be with characterization. We've seen a little bit, like there's automated Rietveld refinement and a few things like that. But I'm curious, what's your take on what the future will look like in something like microscopy? What will be the role, what will be the way that scientists interact with it? Will it be scientists running it? Will it be turning it over to the ML, something hybrid between the two?
It's a super interesting question. And 2 years ago, I would say that if we use machine learning and automated microscopy, we can do the same things as humans, only faster. And there is a figure to merit to that, right? So you can argue that currently we are using microscopes maybe 8-10 hours a day, and then the microscope rests. If we have the ML algorithm working and doing the human level task, then we can use it 24/7, and that increases productivity, and they need less time to make specific decisions. So we can get easily maybe a factor of 10 of their output, maybe even a factor of 20, but probably no more than that. But some of the developments that happened in my group in the last year and with my colleagues at Oak Ridge and Pacific Northwest make me think that I was unduly pessimistic about it. And let me explain why it is the case, both from the point of view of opportunity and from the point of view of how human works and in terms of what it takes to make it happen. So in terms of opportunity, the situation is actually very simple, that our microscopes now operate in the regime of the double technological debt. So we use the same scanning as people used in Ruska time. And this scanning gives us the rectangular images, which are very convenient for the human eye to interpret. So that's why it's double technological. Maybe it's kind of one of this component is technological, another is psychological. That being said, microscopes can, first of all, operate much faster. So the electron microscope can easily generate 32K by 32K image. Human eye can recognize features maybe in 1 or 2K images.
Yeah,
so
nowhere close
if
to
we have
that.
image of this size, we will have to spend considerable amount of time of trying to go through it by eye and find what's interesting. Secondly, typically when we run the microscope or we do the microscopy experiment, we actually have a reasonably good idea about what is that we're after, so what we want to understand. And very often the things that or object that we're interested in don't have the uniform distribution on the material surfaces. So ideally the microscope will not just scan everything and then human looks through the data and try to make sense out of that, but the microscope will actually target the objects or behaviors of interest. So this is the opportunity. So we already know that for electron microscopes, there is at least 3 or 4 orders of magnitude of acceleration that is possible if we learn to analyze the data dynamically. For SPM methods, which are relatively slower, we don't have 3 orders of magnitude, but we can run experiments in a much more smart way. So to increase the ratio of useful observations to the observations in general. So the second part, which is a very big bottleneck at this point. That the humans are exceptionally good in doing what the humans are doing, right? So if you look at the performance of the large language models or the classical benchmark for machine learning, all of them start to basically saturate slightly above the human level. And saturation slightly above the human level, average human level, means well below the human expert. So for the time being, the classical supervised machine learning models, if you deal with the area that you're not familiar with, that can be helped, but you don't expect it to know things better in your own domain. So that's a fundamental limitation of the supervised learning methods. They cannot magically jump out of the distribution or extrapolate. But then the interesting thing becomes whether, rather than trying to use the supervised machine learning, we can define the goals of the experiment in the way that makes sense, and then we let machine learning algorithms to follow those goals as opposed to rely on the data that we have created in the previous experiments. So this mindset is very different from the classical or well-established mindset in the ML community, but it seems to be much better tuned to the way that the experimental sciences work. So in other words, rather than trying to use ML to assist me in doing things that I'm already good at, and then ML only helps me save time, I want to impart my reward structure on the ML algorithm and let it pursue it in the way that it sees fit, given the access to the instrumental control that it can access in the instrument.
So what's missing there, and you've called out in your paper, like the missing link, like the real thing that where this community needs to spend our time is then translating between what the human knows, what they're looking for in the experiment, and the actual reward that you program into the algorithm, right? It has to have something that it has for a feedback loop. And we know, like, if I'm looking at a material and I'm trying to find like a cause of a defect, like what caused this material to break, I kind of have an idea of what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something that's out of the ordinary. I'm looking for certain things that maybe I've seen in the past that caused that. So how do you translate that high-level thinking about the application, right, the end application of what you're doing, to something direct that the microscope can look for in real time? Like, I don't know how we're going to solve that. Any ideas?
So this is super difficult, and we started to have this idea maybe a year ago. So that was the time when I talked to folks at Google, and at some point I asked them a very simple question, like, look, guys, I tried to understand reinforcement learning for several years. So I went through several books. That's not the most trivial area.
No.
But let's say I kind of know enough I went through several elementary examples. By now I understand the basics. I can roughly say and write by memory how the Bellman equations look like. So that's all great, but where do you guys get the reward functions? Because I understand where the reward functions comes in games. I mean, that's what makes games super cool, because the reward is almost instant. And you know what is the long-term reward. But then when I start thinking about, okay, reinforcement learning is great, how am I going to apply it for the real world scenarios like microscopy or material synthesis or what's not? And then I start to realize that for any real problem that I have, I can reduce it to the level of the myopic optimization when the reward function is instant. But it's very difficult for me to formulate the real world problem as the reinforcement learning problem, where the reward is somewhere in the end of the process. And then I talked to the Google folks, and that was slightly before the time when this all concerns about the X risk from AI started to surface. And my question was, where do the rewards come from? Because I kind of feel like this is the part of the reinforcement learning that I don't understand. And then they told, so am I stupid? No, you're absolutely not stupid. That's in fact the most complex part of the reinforcement learning. So if we don't define the reward correctly, then the algorithm starts to do something weird. So my analogy is that imagine that I'm playing the chess with the Boston Dynamic robot, and the robot is told that it has to win. So if you don't specify things better, the robot can easily take the chessboard and hit me on the head, because win is a win. So another example, I guess if you read the Persian fairy tales of the 1,001 Nights and so on, there's always this issue of how you interact with the genies, right? So if you liberate the genie, and the genie is supposed to fulfill three of your wishes, you have to be very, very careful about how you formulate them, because if your formulation allows for Genie takes a shortcut that's good for Genie but not good for you, the Genie will do that. You always want to be happy. One of the ways to get there is to lose your mind, because then you're always happier. And in some sense, the problem with the reinforcement learning and generally reward-driven methods is exactly the same as with the genius. So if you don't formulate what you want to accomplish exactly, the algorithm can find the shortcut that is not something that you're interested in. And then I start to look at it a little bit broader, like what are generally our rewards when we deal with the machine learning algorithm. And then I realized that intrinsic rewards are very, very bare cupboard. We have loss functions. We have different ways to look at for example, symbolic regression and value the predictive error and parsimony of the expression. But these are very, very narrow and very, very specific. In the real world scenario, we actually deal with the much longer term objectives, which can be fairly complex. So this research on interface of how you define the reward functions that translate our long-term objectives and the short-term rewards that can be pursued by the automated experiment, that I think would be super important.
Yeah, and thinking to my own experience with microscopy, a lot of the rewards aren't static either, right? You go into some sort of microscopy, you put a sample in the SEM, start looking at it, and you think you're looking for one thing, and then all of a sudden you find something unexpected, something that you weren't looking for. And that starts to become a new challenge, because now all of a sudden the reward structure has to be reformulated, right?
Yeah, you see something, you're like, well, shoot, why don't we do EDS map? Oh, look at that. Line scan shows this. Oh, maybe this is what's going on, right? Like human is very much there deciding that stuff. So how do you get a algorithm to have this high dimensional way of considering all the different options and all the different reward pathways when it's not completely straightforward?
And notice that this is actually the cool thing about the machine learning when you apply it to experiment. Because when you apply machine learning in theory, effectively, at some point you get to the point we need to scale. Once you start to apply machine learning in experiment, you inevitably start to think, why are we doing science in the first place? What's our goal? So what determines our decision making? Because you can take several people, give them the same sample and same instruments, and the way they will structure the experiment workflow would be totally different. So in some sense, the automated experiment is almost like humanity in the in the toy model of the humanity, when we need to understand why we're making decisions and what drives us. And then if you start to do a little bit of the introspection, or in my case it was introspection forced by the necessity to build the ML workflows for the instrument, you realize that even during the single experiment, as you mentioned, we can pass through multiple rewards. We start with optimizing the instrument. We then proceed to explore the material based on the, for example, observation of if we have some areas in the material that have roughly similar structures, it's natural for us to look at the majority regions. Then we start to do things based on the curiosity. For example, you see weird patterns out there, you try to zoom in on them or try to understand what goes on there. And generally, only after that, we start to think about some specific theories or the high-level thinking. And of course, while we are doing all of that, we also keep eyes open for the serendipitous discoveries. So very often we observe things that we didn't expect, and then we are driven by curiosity on how to do that. So the interesting part is that all these considerations, except for the even including hypothesis-driven discovery, in some sense can be introduced as the part of the automated experiment. So these are well-defined rewards. They can be cast in the language that the machine learning algorithm understands, and in principle, we can run the automated experiment when the machine learning agent runs the microscope and gets the data and issues the commands to the microscope, and the human operator observe the process and sort of shift the reward target for the machine learning agent. And that seems to be the first case where we can do something fundamentally different from how we have been doing microscopy before. So rather than us thinking about what to do and issue the commands, we specify what is that we care about in terms of physics, and then the machine learning agent tells the microscope what to do to pursue those targets most effectively. This is already not a speculation, that's actually practically works. But the more interesting part becomes when we go from the microscopy problem to the outer context problem. So ultimately, we are not doing microscopy for the sake of microscopy, even though a lot of my colleagues probably will disagree. Ultimately, we are doing microscopy starts in the chemistry lab. So we synthesize something, we bring sample for the microscopy, we expect to learn something about the physics or chemistry of material, and the reason why we need it is because ultimately this material is supposed to be a part of something else. And connecting these outside context problems with the experimental planning, that would be a huge thing for the microscopy and characterization in general.
So thinking about reinforcement learning and my own work with optimization in general, I know that reinforcement learning takes quite a lot of data to train and to get right. And the more I've played around with optimization, I've come to find the value of actually simulating optimization campaigns to see how things work out and use that to help maybe guide initial model selection. Is there a role for that in terms of generating fake microscopy data to maybe test out different reward structures, or to maybe ensure that the model is best aligned in advance of putting it towards real data?
Absolutely. So I think that the key constraint in any experimental sciences is that our experimental budgets are limited. So there is nothing we can do about it, and effectively we cannot scale. Even if we try to connect all the microscopes in the world in some common ecosystem that allows sharing the data and algorithms, that will help, but it will not help that much because all scientists like to do different things. So by definition, we all want to go where no one has gone before, which means that working on totally different data sets is not the case where the big data actually can help us accomplish anything. So we need to be very cognizant of the small experimental budgets. And practically, my feeling is that our starting point is dealing with would be the introduction of very myopic workflows when the reward is available in each step. So in this case, we don't have to deal with the large data requirements of the reinforcement learning. So eventually, if we go for the longer experimental campaigns, that may become an issue. But I think that the primary trick would be not to run more experiments, but to be much more responsible and cognizant of how we define the reward functions and how these reward functions connect what we can do in microscopy to the general materials discovery. So that's where the trick is.
Sergei, you're amazing. This has been a fun conversation, very eye-opening for me, somebody who thought I kind of knew this field. Clearly did not. So thank you for sharing with us, man.
Thank you for inviting, and that was very pleasant experience and opportunity to share some of the crazy things that we've been working for the last few years.
Okay.
Yeah, especially being in academia, you only get exposed to these instruments on a very superficial level, right? The SEM takes images, there's certain other characterization techniques, but you never get that chance to really dive into and see how deep all of these different techniques are and all the things you can do with them. So it was really eye-opening and insightful to read through these papers and chat today.
This episode is sponsored by California Nanotechnologies, or Cal Nano. If you've listened to the podcast, you know that we are big fans of them. We've done a couple episodes with them, and I, as a professor, have used their services multiple times over the course of my career. They have some really great services. They've helped us with spark plasma sintering at an extremely large scale, way bigger than what you're thinking. They can make some huge components. I've always had great success with them. They turn out high density, quality parts, to order, and pretty quick turnaround. And they also have some other capabilities, including cryo milling. Check out our episode on that. We think that they're an awesome company, and we're proud to stand by them as a sponsor of the show. The Materialism Podcast is also sponsored by Materials Today. Visit materialstoday.com to stay up to date on the latest happenings in the material science field and read some fantastic articles they have published. You can head over to elsevier.com to find out more about their journals, books, conferences, and related programs.
Thank you as always for listening to this episode of the Materialism Podcast. If you have questions or feedback, you can send us emails at materialism.podcast@gmail.com.
Yeah, we actually love reading those. I love reading messages from fans. And also, if you would do us a huge favor, subscribe to our show. You can find us on iTunes, on Spotify. We used to be on Google Play, but it is now on YouTube. So if you look up Taylor Sparks on YouTube, you'll find them on YouTube as well there. If you leave us a review, we think that will help other people find our content, and that would be pretty rad. And then finally, you can check us out on Instagram. We have the @materialism.podcast page. You can connect with us there, leave a comment. We post lots of behind-the-scenes stuff and videos and pictures. We think you'd like it.
And lastly, we'd like to give a shout out to Alphabot and Kolobyte for making the music for the podcast. They both make a ton of really cool synthwave music, and you can check them out on Spotify and YouTube. Catch you next time.
The inventors of fire, electricity, magnetism, iron, lead, glass, silk, cotton, the makers of tools, the captors of lightning, the architect, the engineer, the musician, are all beneficiaries of the materials of this world and are bound only by their imaginations in manipulating those materials.